Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I have the pleasure and honor to introduce Mr. Raja Shehadeh here in the Bruno Kreisky Forum. It's the first time for us and for you.
For me,
yeah. To be here together. He will be moderated by Tessa Szyszkowitz. Thank you very much. These days, if we look to the Middle East at large, we understand that the focus and attention has been shifting a little bit now, as at least also media suggests. We are focusing more on Syria, more on developments in that part of the Middle East. But the conflict and the war in Palestine, the extinction of the Palestinians in Gaza, the occupation is still going on. And we also understand that it's not only media that actually draws our attention constantly to other spots, be it in the Middle East or otherwise, but also that the narratives are changing, undermined. So there's also a bit of a conflict of narrative, so to speak, and as I kept saying in our conversation, the narrative of Palestinians, the historic narratives, including, of course, also the narratives on the perspective of what is going to happen, is also shifting and changing. So it is in particular important that we have you here, Mr. Shehadeh, one of the most important writers of Palestine these days. He and his wife live in Ramallah, also founder of the Palestinian Human Rights Organization. So it's particularly important to understand and see this long conflict through the eyes, as we will hear from you, through your family, through your father. And I wish you an interesting evening. Mr. Shehadeh is going to give a lecture at the beginning for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then there will be a conversation between Tessa and Mr. Shehadeh, and then followed by questions and answers. So once again, thank you for coming. I wish you an interesting evening, and come again. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much to all of you for coming tonight. It is so important for me that you're here, because Raja Shehadeh for me was for decades, when I lived in Jerusalem, one of these voices where you would always know that he would have something to say that would be good for everyone who is there, constructive, wise and poetic. And so I'm very happy that we could lure you to Vienna now, especially where things are so terrible for Palestinians in the Middle East in general, in Gaza, but also in the West Bank. Raja Shehadeh is an author, he's a lawyer, and he was born just after the Nakba in 1951 in a family that has one of these almost classic, tragic family histories, being evicted from Jaffa, which is now in Israel, going to Ramallah and thinking that they would return. And Raja's father, Aziz, who was a lawyer, always looked at the conflict from the beginning through the eyes of a legal person and was thinking that to bring the refugees back, you only need to apply the law. And one of the tragedies of the Middle East conflict is that the law doesn't always apply. Absolutely. And I think this is one of the big themes also in your work. And when you founded Al-Haq, and as we can see in your new book now, we could have been friends, my father and I, which was just published now. And unfortunately, we have only the other book that was published this fall, but not the new book here at the book stand outside. But please, please go get it, because it is a beautiful story of a father and son who are involved in a conflict that they haven't chosen, but always put up a very constructive fight for the rights of the people who are stuck in the conflict too. And it's also a very beautiful story of you not having the energy to open all the boxes that your father left behind with all his writings, all his cases, all the family histories that were sort of packed away, and how you discover them and how you bring them up in this book, also with all the photographs of the family photo albums, where you can see how the Palestinian existence for all these generations between Akko and Haifa and Jaffa and Jerusalem and Ramallah and Hebron is there and should be, of course, remembered, which you do with your books. There was Strangers in the House, a book that was published at the beginning of the 2000s, 2007?
2002.
2002. And then...
and it is also in German.
And it's also in German. I'm not sure if it's available not in West End. We have to dig it up.
Somebody else.
Yeah, that published it. But then this book that came out in German this fall, which I actually reviewed in Falter in the fall, because I thought it was very interesting that not many Palestinian authors were published in this last year, because the German-Austrian public is very careful with Arab voices, with Palestinian voices, which I find really sad, because it would be much better, of course, if you had as many voices possible. We had here in the fall, in October, a very interesting lecture where Mahmoud Muna came, whose bookshop in Jerusalem, whose bookshops in East Jerusalem were just raided by the Israeli police. And it is really shocking to me that in a conflict where you wouldn't really need the intellectuals to speak up on both sides, of course, but to speak up, that these voices are not heard enough, and not heard enough here in Germany and Austria. So I'm very happy that we have you here now. And please, Raja, I'll give you the word.
Thank you, Tessa. And thank you for inviting me to this forum. And thank you all for coming to hear me. Now let me put my other glasses. I have been a witness and a participant to the Palestine-Israel conflict for over 55 years, since I was a teenager in Ramallah. I have been chronicling in almost daily entries throughout that period. I have also played a part in resisting human rights violations and confiscations. In this talk, I will try to identify patterns that I've discerned that might shed a light on the present devastating situation. Indeed, perhaps the worst period of my experience has been the last 16 months. It took the war in Gaza to make me realize how closely my worldview was related to the prospective peace with Israel. That realization came close to the beginning of the war. As the war went on, with threats of unimaginable destruction, the thought on my mind was that after such knowledge, how can we live together? And yet we must. That is why I spent a lifetime thinking and writing about relations with Israel and have not stopped. In this lecture, I will speak about my conclusions and discuss some of the books I wrote along the way. Let me begin by outlining what I think have been the constants in Israel's wars against the Palestinians. Let's start with the 1948, when there was a total rejection and denial of existence of the Palestinians as a Zionist movement, and then the new state of Israel tried to force us out of Palestine and establish a Jewish state on our land that precipitated the Nakba when 750,000 Palestinians were forced to flee, with around 200,000 remaining in what became Israel. Let's take the case of Jaffa. In the wake of the attacks by Jewish terrorists in April 1948, where my parents lived and where my father had his law office, following the establishment of Israel in May 1948, there was a tremendous amount of looting of Palestinian homes and properties after they were forced out. I now wonder whether my father knew, as he worked for the return of the refugees from his exile in Ramallah to their homes, that 5 months after the city's conquest, Jaffa had been picked clean. There was nothing left in Palestinian houses. I can just imagine father comforting his friends who came to him fretful of what might be happening to their homes, and he, with his eternal optimism, telling them of his efforts and how close he and others are to victory and return. From reading one of the letters of my father that my father drafted to the UN Palestine Conciliation Commission, I know that he was concerned about the lack of watering of the citrus trees in the orchards surrounding Jaffa, which might otherwise not survive. Clearly, he was not aware of the policy Israel was pursuing of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians. I only discovered this letter after I finally came round to opening the cabinet that contained my father's papers, which had remained closed for many years after his murder in 1984. The documents I found there form the basis of my book, We Could Have Been Friends, My Father and I, which is published in German. Perhaps the reason for my delay in inspecting these files was that I was trying to forget the city of Jaffa that had loomed so strongly in my consciousness as I grew up. When I was a child, we would look across the Ramallah hills at the lights in the horizon that we believed were the lights of Jaffa. It was only after 1967, when we were able to visit, that we realized that they were, in fact, the lights of Tel Aviv. The British Jewish journalist John Kimchi, who, by the way, met and befriended my father after the war of 1967, wrote that, quote, "The first people to loot in a wholesale fashion were members of the Irgun. While in the beginning they looted dresses and ornaments for their girlfriends, this discrimination was soon abandoned and they began to snatch anything they could transport out of the city. Everything from furniture and carpets to pictures and housewares. What could not be taken away was smashed. Windows, pianos, fittings, and lamps went in an orgy of destruction." The Israeli General Staff used the word tehur, meaning cleaning or purification, more than 40 years before the concept of ethnic cleansing was coined at the time of the wars in former Yugoslavia. But not all the officers and leaders in Israel were of the same mind. From the book of Adam Raz, Loot, How Israel Stole Palestinian Property, we learned that there were sometimes conflicting voices regarding the looting. Some feared its effect on Jewish society and image of the state. Some were concerned about the future relations with Arabs. They were right to be worried. Avraham Tamir, the Deputy Assistant Chief of Staff for Operations in Central Command, who after the war was responsible for the destruction of many villages, explained that Prime Minister Ben-Gurion asserted the policy that the villages needed to be destroyed so that the refugees would not have a place to which to return. He continued, "I mobilized all the Central Command's engineering battalion and flattened all those villages within 48 hours, period. There was nowhere to which to return." Does this remind you of the Gaza? Without a country of their own, the Palestinians were deemed disposable and stateless. They were not recognized as having memories and attachments to places as we saw in Gaza over the past year and a half. We could have been friends, my father and I, tells the loss of the home of my father in Jaffa and his struggle to achieve a return for himself and the thousands of refugees forced out of Palestine when the state of Israel was established. As I've shown above, reviewing that history makes it clear that while the Israeli leadership was clear as to what it wanted, Ben-Gurion did not always communicate this to his officers, some of whom were concerned about the image of Israel and some of the future relations with the Palestinians. And yet, it took many years of denials and misinformation by Israeli propagandists and scholars before the whole truth of what happened in 1948-49 was revealed. As I argued in What Does Israel Fear from Palestine, this book, without the recognition of the Nakba and the right of return, there can be no movement towards peace between Palestine and Israel. In our new book, Forgotten, Search for Palestine's Hidden Places and Secret Memorials, that I wrote with my wife, Penny, who is here in the audience, we described the erasure of cultural sites and memories and memorials in the whole of geographic Palestine, less Gaza, for obvious reasons. Some have been totally obliterated, some concealed beneath forests, others still standing but in ruins. We meditated on the lost connection between Palestine and the rest of the region. We wrote that book prior to October 2023, and it foreshadows what is now happening in the Gaza Strip of almost total erasure of Palestinian cultural sites. Total erasure of Palestinian sites, cultural Palestinian sites, which is very, very tragic because there are some very important monuments and sites, including one of the oldest churches in the world, and including the mosque of the 7th century, which is very famous and important. This pattern of keeping the real objective of the war unannounced repeats in Israel's future wars. Here I will begin by highlighting the Israeli reinvasion of the West Bank in 2002, which Israel called Operation Defensive Shield, which I chronicled in my book, When the Bulbul Stopped Singing, to show the similarities with the war in Gaza. In The Suppression of Guilt, the media and the occupation of the West Bank, Daniel Dorr wrote, quote, that the common denominator, the fundamental basis, lies in the portrayal of Israel, its government, its military, its people, as an agent without intentions, an innocent society that has been pushed into the operation, just as it was pushed into the entire Intifada by the sheer force of Palestinian violence, with no agenda of its own except self-defense. A desperate attempt to do something whatever possible against terror, unquote. He adds, none of these commentators ever raises or even hints at the possibility that Sharon, who was then the Prime Minister of Israel, actually knew very well what he was doing, that he does have a plan, and that he is not particularly bothered by the fact that the military operation will not lead the parties back to the negotiating table, unquote. So, different voices may be heard, but the leader has a plan which remains undeclared and ends up guiding the war. Does this remind you of the present government of Benjamin Netanyahu? It should also be noted that the fighting is never seen to further negotiations and bring peace, which usually wars are what it's about. Thus, in both the 2002 operation and in the war in Gaza, never was the prospect of negotiating with the PLO or Hamas ever raised. In the Gaza war, Israel portrayed itself as having been pushed into fighting, neglecting all it had done to imprison people of Gaza for the past 16 years that preceded the war. Another common thread that pervades through the wars is the attempt at destroying the interim self-government accords agreed in Oslo in 1993-95 in order to prevent an independent Palestinian state. So the Oslo has been very much in the minds of Israelis, and its destruction has been one of the aims of the wars that Israel fought. In 2002, 2002, there was General Meir Dagan's plan that reflected Sharon's worldview and which had two basic components, and that's from Dor again. First, Arafat is a murderer, and one does not negotiate with or do business with the murderer. Second, the Oslo Agreement is the greatest disaster visited on the people of Israel in modern times, and thus no effort should be spared in undoing it. The plan is to cut the Palestinian Authority into cantons, bits of territory isolated from each other, disconnected from any central government, and handled individually by Israel. Does this remind the audience of words spoken during the Gaza war and the Israeli army and settlers' actions in the West Bank, which are exactly for pursuing this objective? In the Gaza war, there is the general's plan conceived by a retired Major General and former head of the National Security Council, Giora Eiland, and presented to the Knesset by a group of several retired Israeli generals. This plan proposed giving approximately 300,000 Palestinians a one-week evacuation period to depart from the northern third of Gaza before designating it a military exclusion zone. Under this strategy, anyone remaining in the area would be considered a combatant. The plan would then implement a complete siege that would block essential supplies until militants surrender, denying all essential supplies including medicine, fuel, food, and water, representing a radical shift in Israeli military strategy for northern Gaza. It's clear from what we see has happened in Gaza that the army was pursuing this plan without formally announcing that it was adhering to it. Yet, the Gazans knew that this was the Israeli plan. Here is what Atif Abu Saif writes in his war diary from Khan Yunis, Don't Look Left, in the entry November 9, 2 months after the start of the war. By the way, this is a very good book to read about the war in Gaza. Don't Look Left. He writes, the Israeli army always knew what the mission was, ethnic cleansing of the whole strip. When they enter a neighborhood, they're not going to ask, okay, who voted for Hamas in 2006 or who's likely to vote for them in the future, and then just cleanse them. It's not Hamas they're clearing, it's Arabs. When they see you, they will either kill you or force you to leave, whichever is quicker. You have no choice, either you die or you leave. You cannot say that you want to stay peacefully and promise not to trouble the occupiers. Many don't even get the chance they don't even get to choose. The missile just finds them, unquote. On February 6th, US President Donald Trump signed an executive order that authorizes aggressive economic sanctions against International Court prosecutor in The Hague, accusing him of taking illegitimate and baseless actions targeting the US and Israel. Surely the wholesale destruction of Gaza buildings had no essential military necessity, but served another undeclared agenda of making Gaza uninhabitable, so that it is eventually emptied of its people. Some might think that the ceasefire brokered on January 19 and withdrawals from Netzarim checkpoint would mark the end of the general's plan. And yet, as long as the siege of Gaza by Israel is maintained, Netanyahu knows that he holds the key to enforcing his plan through preventing the importation of shelters for the people of Gaza and drilling equipment, earth-moving equipment, and asphalt to enable the reconstruction to begin. A ban on building materials entering the Gaza Strip has been a feature of Israel's blockade since it was put in place in 2007. Rather than making life tolerable for civilians who found their homes destroyed, Trump proposed what amounts to ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip. Under the scheme, Gaza's about 2.2 million Palestinians would be resettled, and the United States would take control and ownership of the coastal territory, redeveloping it into a Riviera of the Middle East. The plan came as a shock to me. I didn't realize that my country was for sale. I didn't realize my country was for sale. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, under the guise of the Gaza war, military operations continued there with the aim of destroying the troubled Palestinian Authority and the resistance. Thus, October 7 and the war in Gaza marked the definitive failure of the Oslo Accords. Far from laying the groundwork for a lasting peace and the coexistence of two independent states, the accords were sabotaged from the start by Israel, which used them as a basis for settling the West Bank, annexing eastern Jerusalem, and isolating the Palestinian Authority. So again, the Oslo Accords become an aim of the destruction of the Oslo Accords, become an aim of the wars Israel has been fighting over the years. The US, European allies, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, and other countries all expressed their interest in working with Israel on a day-after plan that would allow the growth of an alternative Palestinian government. But Netanyahu realized early on that such a government would have to include, to some degree, the Palestinian Authority, and that this would be a red line for his far-right coalition allies on whom he relies on to hold power. Having to choose between the implementation of the war's stated goals or the preservation of his coalition, he chose the latter. There was another similarity between the earlier period and the present in the Israeli response to the ICJ. In 2004, the International Court of Justice at The Hague heard a case against the construction of the wall in the occupied West Bank, the wall that Israel was building to separate the West Bank from Israel, although the wall was built partly on West Bank territory. A case that I participated in. The court concluded that the wall, as it stood, was illegal. What was striking is the Israeli public's reaction to this advisory opinion was the utter sense of guiltlessness. One typical reaction was by a woman who responded, "You sit in judgment while I bury my husband." Likewise, when the International Court of Justice at The Hague in 2024 concluded that there was a probable case of genocide, Israel claimed again that there was anti-Semitism and bias against Israel. Quote, "Israel utterly rejects the false and absurd charges of the International Criminal Court, a biased and discriminatory political body," unquote. The Netanyahu office said in a statement, adding that, quote, "No war is more just than the war Israel has been waging in Gaza." Imagine. As Pinkash Mishra wrote in The World After Gaza, the Israeli scholar Leibovich had warned of this as early as 1967, when he wrote that, quote, "The tactic of conflating Palestinians with Nazis and shouting that another Shoah is imminent was, he feared, liberating ordinary Israelis from any moral restriction, since one who is in danger of annihilation sees himself exempted from any moral considerations which might restrict his efforts to save himself." And I think this is a very important idea that Leibovich had said as early as 1967 and still rings true. What is taking place in the West Bank at present under the disguise of war in the Gaza is intended to destroy any chance of peace with the Palestinian state and the Palestinian state. The same tactics are being used in the West Bank that Israel employed with total impunity in Gaza. These include orders to leave neighborhoods, destruction of infrastructure, demolitions of homes, and killings. And as in the 2002 attack, when Israel destroyed the old city of Jenin, so it is doing this time. Only now it is also destroying the Nur Shams camp in Tulkarem, Tubas, and other villages in the north of the West Bank. Tens of thousands of inhabitants there were forced to leave their homes, some of which have been blown up Gaza style. The infrastructure has been destroyed. Drones and warplanes have taken part in these attacks. It was being suggested that these army raids are to assure the right wing that despite the ceasefire agreement, the war has not stopped. Israel claims it is fighting terror in Jenin camps. But it also closes the West Bank. It also closed West Bank roads, heaving havoc to the economy there. In all these wars, as well as in the policy of settlement, these reveal Israel's denial of the existence of the Palestinians. As I have argued in What Does Israel Fear from Palestine, it is Palestine's very existence that Israel fears and tries to prevent. The very existence of Palestine is what Israel fears and tries to prevent. My conclusion in that short book was that should Israel not accept a fully sovereign Palestinian state living in peace side by side with it, the alternative is that Israel would be transformed into an openly fascist, racist state that has to go from war to war. This was my conclusion. As I wrote these words, the Israeli police was holding the proprietor of the main Eastern Jerusalem bookstore in custody, accused of disturbing the public order by selling books. Selling books in Israel has now been deemed a crime. Let us go back to the question I posed at the beginning. How can the Palestinians live with the Israelis after all that happened after October 7? There are a few grounds of hope, even though slim. Wars usually bring in their wake massive, sometimes unexpected changes. Gaza has in many ways been a game changer for Israel. Israel's reputation has been badly damaged. There are the international criminal cases against Israeli leaders and the global backlash, and the conflict has pushed the Palestinians up to the international agenda as never before. There is also a new generation of global citizens who believe that the Palestinians should be free. Even as Trump calls for ethnic cleansing, even this highlights Israel's crime, because he is saying that it's not a place where people can live. And as David Schulman, a longtime activist for peace between Israelis and Palestinians, wrote in the New York Review of Books, quote, "These days, the uncontested rulers of the West Bank are the marauding Israeli settlers in the illegal outposts that are popping up everywhere. Their express goal is a second Nakba, the expulsion of the entire Palestinian population, Area C, some 62% of the West Bank, over which Israel has sole control," unquote. He also wrote, "Empathy is usually focused on individuals, not on groups. But still, believe it or not, the Palestinians are our sisters and brothers, and someday, if the state of Israel survives, they will be our partners in making peace. There is no other way forward," unquote. On the other hand, not all Israelis feel this way, unfortunately. Yet, there are dissenting voices who care about the loss of Palestinian lives in Israel. A dear Israeli friend wrote to me on September 30, 2024, quote, tomorrow is Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. I thought you might like to see something my niece sent me, powerful and beautiful, commemorating mourning and praying on Yom Kippur, the Palestinian lives lost in Gaza. Let's hold on to these sparks of hope and not resort to despair. Thank you.
Ich weiß, wir werden jetzt, we will try to speak out loud, because in the back of the room, I think people cannot, and we can also make the speech available if Raja agrees on per email. Yes, we were worried about this, so we will try now to reach till the last row a little bit better. Yeah. I have always the feeling people like you, but also Israelis on the other side in this conflict, are hostages of the conflict of their leaderships that cannot get it right. And of course, literally hostages, we have also Israelis still in the Gaza Strip now, kidnapped and brought there by Hamas on October 7th. So there is a lot of pain that has accumulated in the last 1.5 years now, on top of the disaster that was already before there for Palestinians in Gaza under Hamas leadership, but also under Israeli occupation in the West Bank, and in the situation that Gaza in general is being closed off from the world. So if we listen to your words and we think of the title of this lecture, there's not a lot of hope, of course, to come up with how Palestinians and Israelis will ever be able to live together after this new tragedy, which seems so like much worse than anything that already happened in the last 100 years. But I wonder if you can see what these sparks of hope could be, not only on the personal level between Israelis and Palestinians who have constructive thoughts, but also on a political level. Who should speak to whom? Who gives you the sense that there is a plan that could come out of this on a political level? Which do we trust Palestinian Authority in the West Bank? Do we trust a free initiative with Arab neighbors to come together and try to find a constructive way forward? Do you see any Israeli political forces that you think Palestinians could work with? And what is the role of the Europeans in this case now, as we have an American administration, as you said now also, who looks more into dissolving the problem by adding to the tragedy by expelling, or if possible, all Palestinians from the Gaza Strip in their entirety. So where do we look to some hopeful dialogue?
Well, the first thing is that finally there is a little more discussion now, even in Israel, about what has been happening before, which is that Netanyahu's government has always been trying to manage the occupation rather than resolve it. And that is now being open to question. And also Israel is involved in so many wars on so many fronts that it's becoming almost impossible to manage all of that. And then the other thing is that its dependence on the United States is so entire and complete that it's very dangerous for Israel, as we saw in the Ukraine. In one day, Trump has changed his position and put the Ukraine in a very difficult situation. And of course, it's not likely for Israel to be in the same situation with America, but one begins to wonder. And so all these factors are going to be detrimental. But you know, the important thing is that even now, there's no talk at all about Israel compensating Gaza for the destruction that it did. And as long as Israel doesn't compensate Gaza for the destruction, it will repeat and repeat and repeat. And it did the destruction in 2008 and 2009. It did destruction in 2014, and now again. And each time, they didn't pay for the reconstruction. And now they're doing the same in the West Bank. And it's the Gaza gazification of the West Bank. And so B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Report group has just published a report. The Gaza Doctrine is repeated in the West Bank. The Gaza Doctrine. And it's the same doctrine of fighting and destroying and in violation of international law, because the West Bank and Gaza are still occupied territories, and the occupied territories must be protected rather than destroyed. Of course, there is a meeting which started on the March 6th, called by the Foreign Ministry of Switzerland for the signatories, 196 signatories of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And the subject is the protection of civilians in the occupied territories. Now, whether anything will come out of that is unclear, but at least there is that attempt. And there are the ICJ rulings, and so there's a lot of action in terms of international law, but none of it is getting to be implemented. But the time will come, will have to be implemented, I think, and that gives me hope.
Well, we have different court cases now. So we have
criminal cases and
criminal. Yeah, we have this sort of on the level of the states, so that Israel now is being accused of, setting up an apartheid state in the West Bank and in Gaza. But there's also the cases that are connected to individuals at the criminal court and of the International Criminal Court. And I wonder if you see if this is a vehicle that can actually work, because of course, the question is if people will arrest Netanyahu or anyone else if they travel, or if we would also see that this weapon is not, of these legal weapons are not sharp enough to actually get closer to the conflict and to have some impact on it.
It's a test for international law. And the likelihood that they will arrest Netanyahu is very slim, but still it means that he has to be careful. He and others who are under the scrutiny of the court have to be careful where they travel, and it has happened that several who traveled to countries were forced to go back because they were going to be arrested. And there's another important case, which is the International Court of Justice of July last year, which ruled that all the right things, that it is an advisory opinion of the United Nations. But it ruled that the West Bank is occupied territory, that the settlements are illegal, that settlements must be evacuated, and compensation paid for the Palestinians. Now, it's a high probability that all these things will happen, but at least the International Court of Justice has clarified things that Israel had continued to say are not clear, and interpreting them in its own way. So I think that's an important case as well.
I mean, if you think that in the case that you were involved in 2004 about the wall is still there. So there is a limit to what it can do. Does it still change also the consciousness of the cases? So is it better to have these cases being also followed through, and then at least there's a legal basis also for the principle of calling for justice, or does it render it useless if it's being called for and then nothing happens?
Well, each case builds on the other. So the case of the wall established several principles about the occupation, which were used in the case of the genocide again. And so one case builds on another. And at the same time, I was always naive enough to think that law will solve everything because law is very powerful. But now I realize that law without politics, without the political will, doesn't come to very much. But still, law is important, and we cannot do away with it. And I mean, Namibia, for example, had a case in the advisory opinion again, which was very important, and it took years and years and years before it got its independence. But it started there, and that's very important. And again, in the apartheid case of South Africa, apartheid continued to be practiced because the United States in particular was supporting the apartheid regime. And then one day they decided it's not in their interest to do it, and they flipped, and then the whole thing began to unravel. So there's always that possibility. But it starts with the law, and the law is very important to clarify things. And we live in a world which is so chaotic that it's important to have laws, and important to preserve what the experience of the World War II taught us about the destruction which was followed by all these cases, all these laws and all these conventions that are so important, that are now being destroyed, and the world should stand up to their preservation, and they are in the South. And so I cannot say that the law is not important. No, the law is important.
I mean, your father, after 1948, was calling for the right of return for the refugees to be implemented, and that, of course, also didn't happen. But there is a sense, I think, in the conflict that even if people might not physically be able to return, that the right of return should have a part in any peace settlement.
Exactly. You know, he thought that the law is very much in our favor and that it will be implemented. And so he was sure that he would be able to return. And yet it didn't happen. And Ben-Gurion thought that the Palestinians would forget about Palestine in a generation or two, and he was convinced that this would be the case. And rather than this happening, it's exactly the reverse. The new generations of Palestinians who have never been to Palestine, are able to come to Palestine, are now so active with Palestinian politics. In this book, The Forgotten, that I wrote with my wife Penny, we write about the places in geographic Palestine which have been destroyed or obliterated, and it's very important because a niece of mine, my nephew's wife, who was 22, read the book and said, I didn't know anything about these places. So it's an attempt to also introduce these places and these facts to a generation who you know, also one of the things that we mentioned in the book is a geographic trip to all of Palestine, which was done by Kamal Abdel Fattah, to whom we dedicate the book. And he used to take his students of Birzeit to a trip throughout Palestine, geographic Palestine, to tell them about the relationship between history and geography. And I happened to be on that trip also. And I learned a lot from him. And it was very important for me to see this from his perspective. And then when we arrived in Jenin, on the first night, which we were sleeping in the school in Jenin, the army came and arrested Kamal Abdel Fattah. And they said, you cannot continue with the trip. And so I realized that Israel is very worried about Palestinians knowing about their history. And then since 1991, now, Palestinians are not able to go visit even these places in Palestine, and that is intentional so that they will not know the places and they will not have any connection to them. But this doesn't work. It doesn't work because people are attached and know, you know, the fact that they have the right of return is not recognized means that people become even more adamant that they're deprived and they must be recognized and they must be recognized.
I mean, one of the things that really worked in the Palestinian national movement is the question of memory.
Yeah.
Because that happened in all the refugee camps in the neighboring states also, that people kept the keys, for example, to the houses and told the stories to their children and to their grandchildren.
But not only in the refugee camps, all over.
All over, yeah. You probably had in Ramallah the keys to the house in Jaffa.
I still do.
And who is in your house in Jaffa now?
I think they changed it into, they cut it into two parts, and some people from Bulgaria or something.
Have you ever gone back, knocked on the door and said hello?
We did.
And?
It was very tragic because my father was so upset, he wanted to leave immediately. And I felt with him, for him. Yeah.
It's very painful because your father, of course, what he was famous for was to see immediately after the Nakba that there was a need for a plan to have a settlement with Israel to get part of Palestine under control of Palestinians next to Israel.
Yeah.
And of course, he not only did nobody in Israel listen to him, or not many, but also on the Palestinian side or on the Arab side of the neighboring countries, people were not entertaining this plan of coexistence in the first years on a political level. And so everyone lost the chance to actually build something next to each other in peace.
And I'm often told by people now in the leadership how they regret that they didn't listen to my father.
Yes, obviously. I mean, it would be much better if people would have listened to your father. And also to the Israeli voices on the other side who sort of thought there should be a settlement that made it possible for two states to be next to each other. But so if you look at this now, I wonder if you are also upset about the fact that there is no Palestinian leadership that actually took this forward. You know, there was your father was working with the PLO and also supportive, of course, of having Palestinian representation and self-determination within any council, any negotiations, where a lot of also the Arab neighbors were quite happy not to have the Palestinians as their own entity.
Exactly.
But certainly the Israelis were not willing to allow this up till the 90s, basically. So how difficult was it for your father and also for you to see that the Palestinian leadership didn't, you know, come to the conclusion earlier and stronger to fight for a compromise?
Well, he was despairing in the early 80s when he saw the settlements being built at a fast rate, and he thought that there will not be enough, even a place for him to be buried in Palestine if this continues. And that made him very feel that the time is lost, and he became despondent. And that was the only time he became despondent. But I think that the Palestinian Authority has since made it its own policy now to have a state in Palestine, in the occupied territories, end of occupation, state in Palestine. And this is why the Israelis see it as an enemy now, because they don't want to hear anything like that. And at the same time, Hamas had some movement in its manifesto of 2017, where it was willing to entertain the possibility of a truce, long-term truce with Israel. And yet, the Israelis did not, said they're lying and they didn't take them up. So diplomacy has not been pursued at all, and that's why we're where we are. But the Palestinian Authority has been consistently saying that they are for a Palestinian state and negotiation on the Palestinian state, end of occupation, and yet Israel doesn't want to hear that at all and doesn't take it up.
Do you think it would be possible to have elections in the West Bank in the near future to establish maybe a sort of legitimate Palestinian government? Because at the moment, of course, Gaza is destroyed. You cannot expect to have elections. The West Bank is under extreme stress by the Israeli army and the settlers going crazy there. So it's very difficult to see how elections could be even held, or a leadership could come together to find its way to one. And also that, of course, the Palestinian population in general, I guess, is sort of politically radicalized. I mean, we run also the danger that you elect political forces that people in Europe and in the States would not want to include in negotiations. What do you think can be done there?
Well, the first thing is that in the Oslo Agreement, there is a clause that, or a whole part, a whole section about elections, and that elections should be held in all of the Palestine, meaning West Bank, Gaza, and Eastern Jerusalem. And yet Israel has never, well, it consented twice to elections and not anymore, because Eastern Jerusalem is out of, they don't want elections there at all. And now that the situation is so separated between West Bank and Gaza, if the Palestinians hold elections in the West Bank, then they are fortifying the separation between the two parts, and that's not possible. And so it's a dilemma. But really, without elections, to choose a leadership, it cannot go forward, and that's very important. Yeah. But then if the powers that have a say in the subject can bring it about, it can happen. There's never impossibility to hold elections. There's always a way.
Yeah, we must hope for that. But the problem that could also happen is that what the US administration is planning, for example, is just to have negotiations without the Palestinians and sort of not allowing free elections because they might not like the outcome. So that's a very complicated situation to tackle because on the other hand, you need to have some kind of plan that goes forward where I wonder who can even talk to whom. On the Israeli side, of course, if you have elections now, you might not necessarily have a situation where you have a government that wants constructive conversations on anything.
That's true. That's true. But the United States is not a party that is going to help, because the United States has always been helping Israel in destroying itself. But the hope is that there will be forces in Europe and in the United States who would realize that if you want to help Israel, you cannot protect it all the way. You help Israel by making them see that what they're doing, the policy that they're pursuing is self-destructive. And if that happens, then huge changes would happen. Because Israel is destroying itself, literally destroying itself, between the internal forces that are so contradictory and between the wars that they are continuously engaged in, and between the economy that is going down the drain and adamant about not making peace with the Palestinians. They're destroying themselves.
When one of the things that your father was very involved in was standoffs, actually, with King Abdullah of Jordan in 1949, in the discussion of how Jordan would administer the West Bank at the time, and your father was, of course, arguing for a sort of more and more autonomy for the Palestinians, which to a certain extent was also given. But the problem was always that all the leaderships of the countries around Palestine and Israel were having their own self-interest. Now, if you look at the situation that Trump just wants Jordan and Egypt to take hundreds and thousands of Palestinian refugees, which, as you described aptly, amounts to ethnic cleansing of the Gaza Strip, with the West Bank following on its heel if it comes to the will of some of the extreme parts of the Israeli government, but also of this erratic US administration, then the question is, how can the King of Jordan, but also the Egyptian government, even push back against the pressure, because America has a lot of leverage, and they have, a lot of military aid going into Egypt, for example. So I always watch this situation and hear that the rejection of any of these plans, and I wonder if they might give in to a part of this plan in the end, or do you think it is absolutely impossible?
Well, I always thought that it's impossible because if the Palestinians were to be moved to Jordan, then Jordan would be destabilized entirely. And that is against the interests of Britain, for example, and Europe. And so it is unlikely for that to happen. And then if Israel really pushes the Palestinians out of Gaza, it would be outrageous, and there would be a reaction in the world to it. And so I don't think that it is a likely scenario, but who knows?
Well, we certainly heard the rejections from the European governments of this idea, and it is also a terrible idea for everyone involved. But it is the situation that we have now. We see it with Ukraine, that that President Zelensky goes to Saudi Arabia, where the US administration is talking to a Russian delegation over the heads of the Ukrainians. And I think we are at this moment where we don't even know how conflicts that we have not been able to solve before the meltdown of the Western democracy, formerly called US, formerly called the Western democracy, which is the USA, is now influencing and changing the situation. You know, a lot of people then have the feeling, oh, maybe Trump moves something around, maybe something comes out of it, but the only thing that we can see so far is disaster looming. So is there any way where you can see that, for example, the Arab states can get together and have some constructive idea?
They did. They had a conference lately, and they made a plan for Gaza. And the plan has been supported now by European countries, not Israel and the United States, but European countries. And the plan is for reconstruction of Gaza, and it seems reasonable. Well, but then one thing that I thought was interesting is that the US envoy who was speaking to Hamas said that America, the US, is not an agent for Israel. So it seems they are beginning to realize that they have been too submissive to Israel and to Netanyahu, and now they want to have their own policy. What is that policy? Who knows? But at least they might be standing up to Netanyahu, because Netanyahu has given them a hard time, very hard time, and they cannot take it anymore. And there is a limit to patience. And maybe the limit has been reached in the case of Netanyahu.
Well, let's see.
That's hopeful.
Before we open to the floor, I wanted to ask you also a more personal question, because you've been living in Ramallah for almost all your life, with the ability also to leave, fortunately. So we have you here. Some of the guests that we would like to come from the West Bank cannot come. Then we can, of course, also not bring guests from Gaza at the moment. So how is the situation? Is it more difficult for you now to move? Is Ramallah still relatively okay? How long does it take for you to leave Ramallah and travel to Europe? Do you go via Jordan? Can you go via Israel?
You know, Ramallah has been surrounded by settlements, and all the roads leading out of Ramallah are with checkpoints. And so to leave from Ramallah, even to Jerusalem, which is a 10-minute walk, a 10-minute drive, now takes 3 hours. And so it's a very complicated situation. And all the hills which we like to walk in and hike in, and I'm a walker, we are not able to, because there is settler violence, and this has been going on since 16 months now. And so it's a difficult life. And life within Ramallah is more or less going on. It's like a bubble, Ramallah. But all around it is tragedy, and we cannot move around. I haven't been to Nablus, for example, which is a 45 minutes drive, or Bethlehem for a year now, no more than a year. And and Gaza I haven't been to since 2000, since the year 2000. I haven't been to Gaza, which is a place that I used to go to often. And so it's very restricted life now in the West Bank, and very difficult. And also the anxiety of being under the threat of more and more violence is terrible to live under. But that's the case.
One of the chapters in Raja's new book about his father is, or for me it was one of the most touching chapters, was that you in you were sitting over after 1967, you were sitting over the first maps that the Israeli military government put out to start building roads.
84,
sorry, in 1984. Yeah. And you were sitting there, and you went to your father, and you said, like, we have to immediately start a campaign, a legal campaign, to stop this.
Yeah. Because they made a plan, a roadmap.
Yes.
And that plan was supposedly legal, but it wasn't legal because it was violating the local law and international law. And so I said, we must take a case against it to stop it. Go on, sorry.
And he had his mind in something else. He didn't react immediately. And as we know, it is also not so easy to fight military occupational power on these matters. But I think it touched me because it's sort of the idea that you sit and you see something coming. And every one of you who has been traveling in the West Bank, or as I have over the decades, and we saw how the situation changed. I mean, it's sort of this past 30 years that I have been there, where you saw at the beginning a settlement here and there, and you as a young man seeing this coming and not being able to stop it. And now we have a situation where there are more settlements than anyone could think of sort of uprooting there for, you know, which was still would have been a possibility in the 90s. In the 90s, it was already difficult. So I wonder if you don't despair of the situation and think it's all too late to fight.
You cannot despair because we have no choice. We have to keep on fighting. We cannot despair.
Thank you, Raja. I think this is really admirable that you can still sort of come up with this spirit to fight on.